Welcome back. Elizabeth Ombati is using her lived experience to advocate for disability issues. Her recent training as a professional fellow on Inclusive Civic Engagement has boosted her advocacy role. Take a look.
For too long, the voices of women and girls with disabilities have been muted and their potential untapped.
It's not always that these decision-making spaces are open to women with disabilities, but then for me it's really the gospel that in every space we have voices of women with disabilities in their diversities, which is really crucial that people also understand the diversities within the movement and then being able to engage them, especially those who are most likely to be left behind, including women who are deaf-blind or women with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. So just having that in mind, that there's diversity within the disability movement, and how do we ensure that we are not leaving any of the women with disabilities behind.
They face double discrimination both for their gender and their disability, creating barriers to education, employment, and leadership opportunities.
Many of us, especially young women with disabilities, don't have to take so long, to realize their dreams because they have an impairment. But then they're in a space where, even as young women with disabilities, young students, because we also work with student leaders with disabilities in institutions of higher learning, that they can find, these dreams, or they can realize them at an early age, as opposed to me, who I think realized most of this in my 30s, and I feel that my 20s would have been better.
Elizabeth Ombati is a passionate advocate for disability rights. She knows firsthand the challenges faced by women and girls with disabilities.
What I do, how I use my writing skills, for example, to create awareness in national newspapers, I hope that plays a small role in addressing challenges that people with disabilities face, but also then my work within organizations as well. Initially, I used to work with an organization called Users and Survivors of Psychiatry in Kenya, where we did a lot of awareness creation on what it takes to include people with psychosocial disabilities in our communities, and supporting us to be self-advocates, supporting many people to actually talk about these issues. So I see that as an avenue that I use to be able to support in a small way that people with disabilities are included in our communities.
Using her experience as a yardstick, she has dedicated her life to empowering others to find their voice and claim their rightful place in the society.
A lot of my advocacy is, now that it's based on my own lived experience, is to see then how do we, or at an individual level, how do I support especially young girls with disabilities to be able to be self-advocates, because that's how I see myself, as a self-advocate. Not only just locating my own experiences within the experiences of others, as I've done over these many years. I had this mental health condition, then I thought it is the reason that I sort of got stuck. But then being able to get peers, people who experienced what I did experience, and then having these people that encouraged me, held my hand, and actually introduced me to the disability community, where then I feel that I've developed most of my strengths within the disability community. Not just talk about my own experiences, but then to connect with other experiences and just be able to ask ourselves that how do we sometimes push our communities to include us, what I call self-advocacy, that we can talk about ourselves and what we want actually, what our communities can do for us to thrive and succeed in what we want to do.
Psychosocial disabilities, often invisible, can be particularly stigmatizing. This can include mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, or bipolar disorder. These conditions can create significant barriers to social inclusion and often lead to isolation and marginalization.
Before I had my mental health diagnosis, it was very difficult, in school, in work, keeping work. And it was also very difficult for me to share what I was going through, because then I thought having a mental health condition wasn't a valid enough thing to tell people that I struggle at work because I have a mental health diagnosis. And at that point, it was more a personal endeavor for me to check online. I really used to search online that are there people with similar experiences as mine. I got an online support group then. It was in early 2000s, yeah. And so I realized that with support with others, being able to meet other people who had similar experience as me would actually make my life or living easier. Of course, it wasn't easy because I hardly kept jobs. Like I remember, because I would work for about 9 months and quit because of the stresses at the workplace and my inability to also say that I needed extra supports as a worker. So you see, and back then I used to think that me quitting jobs was because I had a mental health condition.
Initiatives such as professional fellowship programs are playing a crucial role in this transformation by providing targeted training in leadership, advocacy, and communication skills.
This is a program funded by the US State Department where disability professionals or disability activists from countries in East Africa, so that would be Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, where you apply because then an open call is made, inviting people, disability professionals to apply. So I applied for this particular one, and in 2024, I was honored and really lucky to be picked. And I did spend 6 weeks in the United States because that's what the fellowship does. It takes at least 9 to 10 fellows to different states in the US. And what happens is that when you go to the US, you're placed under a host institution. So there's a mentor and a host institution, and most of the time the mentor is based in the host institution. So I was hosted by the Kansas University Center on Developmental Disabilities under Dr. Ivan Dean, where then we were able, with Ivan Dean, who works a lot in community engagement, just going to the community and seeing then how does the university work to ensure that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are involved, as this was particularly within inclusive employment. So being able to go to the community and see how does engagement occur at the community level. And so I was really lucky to be there to experience the 6 weeks in the US. And I also think one of the things that these fellowships do, apart from creating mutual connections between Americans and Kenyans, or of course other countries, one of the things I think it did to me is really increase my own confidence in terms of how I elaborate my work or how I do my advocacy.
One of the goals of the PFP exchange while I'm here is to determine ways that our center can support Liz and the network going forward. So we've been talking about that and communicating about that. For example, we've been using the SDLMI while we're here, and I think we'll have conversations about if that's a good model to use going forward, and maybe some changes that we need to make for the Kenyan culture and context. But then we can train teachers around Kenya to use the model with their students.
The impact of this empowerment is far-reaching. They bring unique perspectives, innovative solutions, and a deep understanding of the needs of their peers.
How do we support young girls to be able, young girls with disabilities in particular, to just be able to set leadership goals, both in their communities and their families, and trying to see that could this be one way that then we support women with disabilities in leadership, because then we also recognize the underrepresentation of women with disabilities in leadership are both what is very visible, like for example, we'll say women with disabilities who are governors or who are members of parliament, but then also what is not seen, that in schools we still have young student leaders with disabilities, but then so how do we support young women? So that was Kajiado. Mombasa as well, we had amazing conversations, where someone says, for example, when we talk about climate change and inclusion, this one really stuck in my head, where someone says, I would actually wish that students with disabilities can plant trees, but sometimes I worry that there's no one to look after these trees. Such dreams, I don't know if to call them dreams, but such aspirations, because then it's leadership aspirations, or others saying that our learners with disabilities in school, for example, are not offered reasonable accommodation when we are doing exams. So recognizing the small things that happen in their own communities and just asking themselves, how do we work towards this?
It's about recognizing the worth and potential of every individual, regardless of their disability.
At our center, we really focus on creating inclusive communities and working with people with lived experience of disability to create those communities. I think we recognize that as trained researchers, we have kind of a privileged position around research, but that our expertise is only part of the story, that we also need to understand the perspective of people with lived experience of disability, which is an equally important expertise that we include in our research. So we partner, we hire, and also partner with people with lived experience of disability in the community to do our work.
So as someone who identifies as a person with a psychosocial disability, and I think what has really worked for me over the years is creating a community of support around me, people that I can speak to anytime. The network of women and girls with disabilities are amazing. There are people that I can always talk to. I have friends from the network who are going around with me to the meetings, which is really great support around me. But of course, my family as well. My husband and my kids understand. Sometimes it's very difficult leaving your kids and just moving around all the time. But just having that support around me has really, really helped me. And of course, I acknowledge not everyone gets to have that level of support, but then just hoping and praying that as we talk or as we become strong self-advocates, that we are able to cultivate communities of support around us, that when we want to do something, we are not doing it alone, that we have people around us who can support us, that if not, I'm not available to be with my mentor, for example, then there's someone else who is walking around with